The shelling may have stopped, but the damage has been done. U.S. and Israeli leaders meet to cement a ceasefire, but will the tenuous peace hold while Palestinians try to rebuild Gaza? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the fragile truce between Hamas and Israel. For 11 days, bombs rained from the sky above Gaza, killing hundreds of Palestinians and wounding thousands more. Hamas rockets fired into Israel killed at least 12 civilians there before desperate efforts to broker a ceasefire led by Egypt finally came to fruition last week. So far, the truce has held, but both sides have warned of retaliation over any violations. Meanwhile, as the dust settles, the true extent of the damage is becoming clear. Homes have been reduced to rubble, businesses have been devastated. Aid agencies are struggling to respond to Gaza's growing humanitarian crisis. The UN says it will launch an appeal to repair the damage, but a long-term solution is what's really required. Washington has promised to do what it can, and this week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken made his way to the region to try to further reduce tensions. But while airstrikes may have stopped, Palestinians are still suffering, and many are questioning the point of rebuilding if the cycle of violence could simply start again. So is there anything that could ensure a lasting peace? Well, to try to answer that, I'm joined from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank by Nour Odeh, former spokesperson for the Palestinian Authority. And in The Hague is Mouin Rabbani, co-editor of Jadaliyya, an online magazine focusing on the Middle East, and a senior fellow at the Institute for Palestine Studies. Thanks both so much for being with us. First, let's look at U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The two delivered rather brief comments with no questions from reporters following their talks. And I don't think there was much in there that Palestinians really wanted to hear. Nour, would you agree?
Yeah, it doesn't look like this administration has any interest in even thinking about a way to get out of the mess that 4 years of Trump administration policies and a protracted reign of Benjamin Netanyahu and the right wing in Israel, as well as the crisis in Palestinian politics. All of those put together don't really jive with the Biden administration's determination to keep reading from the old books that no longer apply. We saw their statements. We saw how they had to be pushed into having even a minimal role in reaching a ceasefire. So I'm really not sure what Blinken is here to do, but I doubt that he has any concrete plans or proposals to offer.
Right, and it was noted as well, Mouin, overall, that Netanyahu's tone was again to express that joy, that relief that the U.S. steadfastly stands by Israel's right to self-defense. And in that, Israeli action taken over the last 2 weeks was therefore entirely justified. I mean, where does that leave prospects for any further peace negotiations?
I think one has to understand that the United States considers Israel a strategic ally, one through which it will stand by through thick and thin, and considers the Palestinians either terrorists or terrorists on probation. And I think that, in a sense, is all you need to know about the American approach to this issue. I think it's important to note that when they first took office, President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken made very clear that this was not an issue that they considered a priority. It was one they preferred not to deal with. They were effectively sucked in by their Israeli allies' actions, first in Jerusalem and then the Gaza Strip. And I think Blinken's primary mission now is to try to restore business as usual, which of course suits Israel and the United States very well, but is catastrophic for the Palestinians. And I think his second objective is to find ways to strengthen the Palestinian Authority and weaken Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And that's kind of difficult when you insist that the Palestinian Authority should be serving U.S. and Israeli rather than Palestinian interests.
And they
And
had the
perhaps,
Palestinian, I mean, they had the Palestinian Authority on side prior to Hamas. That still really made no progress. But let me ask you quickly, Mouin, if the cost of defending that strategic ally that they see Israel as, the Americans, if the cost is worth whatever benefits they think they get out of it.
it depends, of course, how you look at it. The former Secretary of State Alexander Haig once famously described Israel as a stationary and unsinkable U.S. aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean. I think there are now more and more people in the United States political establishment and within the Democratic Party who tend to view Israel more as an albatross around Washington's neck. And I think it's noteworthy that over the past several weeks, you not only had very large popular demonstrations in the United States in solidarity with the Palestinians, but also key figures in the Democratic Party either coming out against Israel or refusing to defend it, as would have normally been the case in the past.
Okay. You know, Nour, we've been here before. The same miserable cycle of destruction followed by calls to rebuild and then concern from would-be international donors to begin reconstruction as soon as possible while all the underlying issues remain unresolved and will likely start conflict again. So what is the point actually of rebuilding now? Is it just to relieve the conscience of the international community?
Well, I mean, the international community has been managing this conflict for so long. I don't think that right now they have the main actors have the imagination or the energy really to work on solving it. And I think it falls on the Palestinian side to kind of set a completely different agenda. And as Mouin was saying, there are significant developments happening, not just at the popular level in the United States and in European capitals, but also among, decision makers and influencers within the ruling parties, including the Democratic Party. And I think there's a great opportunity to harness that change and to, build bridges with it and push towards solving the conflict, solving the underlying issues. All of this would not be on the agenda if the international community was focused more on ending the occupation rather than cleaning up its mess and covering up its crimes. But I think it will really depend on what kind of agenda the Palestinians insist on. And at this point, with Palestinians continuing to be divided and seeming to be unable to reach a common agenda due to many factors, including intransigence by the current leadership, if I may say so, then it will be very difficult for Palestinian interests to kind of supersede the lazy agendas that we have coming from Washington and others.
And Nour, other than those Democrats in Congress you mentioned there, who do Gazans actually have on their side? We have the U.S. playing such a prominent role, while Egypt, who's helped blockade the Gaza Strip, actually negotiated the ceasefire. I mean, is Egypt a friend of Israel or the Palestinians? Who do the Palestinians actually have? Gazans in particular.
Well, Palestinians, including Palestinians in Gaza, have, first and foremost themselves to depend on. But I think the overwhelming popular support has been very noteworthy. It's unprecedented, really. I mean, sure, every time there is an onslaught of this proportion, there is international solidarity, but I think we can safely say that this time around it was very different. Egypt is a very strategic and very important player in the region, especially for Gaza. So like it or not, like Egyptian policies or not, everybody understands that this is the big brother in the neighborhood and everybody has to kind of make way for that Egyptian role. It's inescapable, if you will. And at this point, I think Egypt will have a far bigger role in reconstruction, in maintaining the ceasefire, precisely because also the Palestinian system is broken.
Okay. And Mouin, there is another player involved, if I can address this with you. Arguably, to what extent? Maybe you can explain. I mean, Netanyahu particularly honed in on that player being Iran in his comments following his meeting with Anthony Blinken. It was a pretty clear warning that he sees Hamas and Iran as partners in this, and a warning to one is seemingly a warning to the other.
I think once again, if you look back at Netanyahu's lecturing of foreign diplomats about a week ago, he was basically regurgitating the traditional Israeli narrative that Israel is not just fighting for itself, but is kind of defending the entirety of Western civilization by sowing enormous amounts of death and destruction upon the Gaza Strip. And this is kind of a traditional propaganda tactic. I'm not asking you to support me. I'm supporting you, and we're one and the same. And of course, Iran and Hezbollah have been supportive of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and have been assisting them in various ways. But I think it's also important to look at Netanyahu's message in a slightly different context, which is that he is still effectively at war, if I can use that term, with his benefactors in Washington about an entirely different issue, and that is the American efforts to rejoin the Iranian nuclear agreement. And I think that's the point that he was really speaking about.
Okay. They also both agreed on this point of rebuilding Gaza without benefiting Hamas. Nour,
yeah, good luck.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. How does that even work? Nour, go ahead.
Well, I was about to ask you. Oh, sorry, Nour.
Sorry, Mouin, go ahead.
Go ahead,
No, I was
Mouin.
going to say, I mean, yes, Hamas is a political movement, but it also happens to be the actual government in the Gaza Strip. Now, regardless of how you look at the situation, if the United States genuinely believes that it can give the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah the power and authority to take the lead in reconstruction, and Hamas is just going to stand aside and allow itself to be consigned to irrelevance, it's flabbergasting that they would even think this. But I think it speaks to a more important point, which is, again, that on the American agenda is not trying to do anything about Israeli accountability or halting Israeli impunity, but once again, it's getting involved in internal Palestinian politics and trying to appoint, favorites and others. And rather than encouraging Palestinian reconciliation and unity, the Americans, like their Israeli friends, see this as a threat, and they're trying to play them off against each other by, promoting the Palestinian Authority, weakening Hamas, favoring this guy, disfavoring that guy. And it's a very old practice, which is called divide and rule. And what I think is important here is what we've seen as the Palestinian public on the street overtake their leaders and force unity upon the Palestinians, or mobilize on a unified basis. And that's what I think, as Nour was saying earlier, is a much more important development.
Right. And, Nour, in all of this, in both statements today from Netanyahu and Anthony Blinken, nothing was said about illegal settlements and displaced Palestinians that actually started this latest round of violence. I mean, wouldn't that be kind of the simplest fix? To just abide by international law? Couldn't the U.S. at least just grant that and build from there?
Yeah, you'd think that's the logical way to go, right? The easiest, shortest path to sanity is straightforward. Yet we know that ever since taking office, this administration has danced around and gone through hoops in order to avoid the subject, in order not to kind of pay up on the expectation that it would be more aligned, or at least more closely aligned with international law, that it would readjust US policy on settlements, for example, that it would at least reopen the US consulate in East Jerusalem. It has yet to do so. It hasn't moved an inch from where Donald Trump took it. And so, like we've been saying, I don't see this administration wanting to take any policy steps that would indicate a change. They're very comfortable reading from a very old book that is no longer relevant. And I think that events on the ground and the internal Palestinian dynamics will overtake all their, pre-arranged and pre-packaged rhetoric and statements. Okay. In addition to what Mouin was saying about the dynamics in relation to the Iran nuclear deal, that, let's be comfortable going back to the same old game with the Palestinians. I don't think that will work. I don't think that there's a lifeline there for current US policies, because I think that internal domestic Palestinian politics are going in a completely different direction. The status quo for Palestinians is not tenable, and there has to be movement internally for things to kind of stabilize again, because at this point they're very precarious.
Okay, Nour Odeh, I will give you the last word. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank both you and Mouin Rabbani for joining us. And best of luck going forward. Thanks both.
Thanks for having us.
Now, it might be hard to imagine what would lure an entrepreneur to take risks investing in the Palestinian territories with so few guarantees of stability and decades of occupation. My next guest, though, has taken that risk and even went as far as to open an office in Gaza for a startup social enterprise built to create opportunities for aspiring writers in underrepresented communities, while also creating much-needed employment. It's called Open Screenplay, and last week, their office was bombed, alongside others, in an Israeli airstrike. The Canadian Palestinian founder and CEO of Open Screenplay joins me now to talk about what it means to invest in a population with so much need, yet so much uncertainty. Khaled al Sabawi, thank you so much for joining us.
First, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. First, clarify, was your office actually a target of that air raid, and what did you lose as a result?
Well, I mean, we think the destruction of our office building is a result of Israel's indiscriminate and wanton bombing of Gaza. I don't think it was specifically targeted more than it was just Israel's policy of collective punishment to hit, random civilian buildings and office buildings to cause as much pain and suffering on the already suffocating people of Gaza. Okay,
now it's important to point out that you are actually headquartered in Canada. Your investors are both Canadian and American, among some other nationalities, if I'm not mistaken. And you'd been advised when opening your office, particularly in Gaza, to remain neutral in the Israel-Palestine conflict. But last week, you really decided you have to respond and condemn what's happened. Why?
Well, because an airstrike, because a missile landed in our building and blew up our office indiscriminately. So we had no choice but to take a stand.
What do you think might be the consequences, though, of taking a stand, given that advice from some of your investors was to stay out if you want to keep revenue flowing?
Well, look, our investors, fortunately, were very supportive of us taking a stand. And, they joined us as a company because of the principles that we stand for. And, we put those principles in practice, and following the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, sought to help uplift those that are living in the most impoverished parts of the world, which is why we went to hire a talented team of developers in Gaza, and we set up a satellite office. So they were supportive of that from the beginning, and they were supportive of us standing to take a stance against Israel's indiscriminate bombing of our office building.
And now you've said you want an investigation into the bombing that destroyed your office. To what end? What do you think you might get out of that?
Well, we think accountability is extremely important. It's important, for business executives, and it's important for leaders of nation states. And it's fundamental that the leadership of Israel is held accountable for crimes that they've committed in Gaza. I mean, our office building not just housed our satellite office in Gaza, but there was an insurance company there named Jadaliyya Insurance. There was a bank and a charity, the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, in addition to residential and other office units. And 4 innocent people were killed when that building was hit. So, what kind of world do we live in if heads of state are allowed to get away with such crimes? So we are calling for the Canadian government to hold Israel accountable for what they've done in Gaza, what they've done to our office building, and more importantly, we're calling for the Canadian government to hold Israel accountable to the crimes of apartheid that it is committing against the people in Gaza and Palestinians in the West Bank, and in Jerusalem, of course. And this is according to Human Rights Watch's recent report, which condemned Israel's crimes of apartheid.
What happens, by the way, to your staff now? Will they remain employed with your company? Will they be able to work now that you've lost that facility?
Yes, they will. I mean, they are working remotely right now. They're a very agile team. And I just want to state, for your audience, Gaza has about 1.8 million people in one of the most densely populated regions in the world. There's about 4,000 people per square kilometer, and 50% of that population is below the age of 15. 60% is below the age of 24. So Israel is really blockading and strangling a majority of children population, a majority of a young population in Gaza. And they are very resilient, very hardworking, and extremely passionate, which is why we hired them. And, in spite of the destruction, in spite of the suffering, and in spite of the psychological trauma that they're going through, they still remain optimistic, hopeful, resilient, and very hardworking. So, of course, we will definitely continue to hire developers in Gaza.
Okay. We're seeing some lovely pictures of some 8 staff members there from your Gaza office right now. Fortunately, as you said, none of them were actually harmed. They weren't at the office when the building was hit. It needs to be said as well that this venture into Gaza with their social enterprise was not your first business in the Palestinian territories. You have other rather large businesses in the West Bank as well. Have you had success with those other ventures? And how hard has it been to work as an entrepreneur and businessman in the territories?
Yes, I'm very grateful to say that we have had success in spite of the challenges of working in the occupied Palestinian territories. It's what, as Nietzsche said, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And, the obstacles that we face in Palestine, working there, really serve as, further inspiration for us to constantly problem solve and constantly find unique solutions to these problems that we face. So we, in spite of all these challenges, we have been very successful. And many of the challenges we face are a result of the occupation. For example, one of the other businesses that I run in the West Bank has a well-known real estate project called Tabo. Tabo.ps is the website. And we take parcels of land and we create title deeds in areas of the West Bank and bring roads and infrastructure so we can protect those lands and allow Palestinians to own affordable lands. Well, the settlers, Israeli settlers, tried to obstruct our project. They tried to use violence and intimidation to try to prevent us from building these projects. But we didn't succumb to their tactics. And we actually took them to court and sued them, and won recently a case that forced the Israeli military to protect our construction workers. So, we hold this as a badge of honor. We don't succumb to these challenges. We're ready to face them no matter how challenging they are, because we really believe that Palestinians have the right to participate in an economy. They have the right to earn a living like everyone else around the world, and we're really there to help them.
Why do you personally, though, feel the need to continue building businesses in the Palestinian territories? Is it because of your heritage?
Well, I was raised on this principle growing up. My parents. So just to give you a little bit of a story, my parents were Palestinian refugees. My father's family owned a large piece of land just outside of Jaffa in 1948. And when Israel was created, they lost that land. And suddenly he saw his family go from owning these assets to living in tents in a refugee camp in Gaza. And his family members were now just laying on mattresses. And he remembered seeing how difficult it was to live in such poverty. And he made it a principle in his life to create economic opportunity for Palestinians so that they can become independent. And those were the principles that I was raised on. And I was, fortunately able to grow up in Canada, one of the most progressive and multicultural societies in the world. And I was raised on that principle that if we Palestinians who, were raised in countries with immense opportunity, if we don't go back to help out, then really who will?
Right. Very quickly, what do you say then now to other potential investors and entrepreneurs that might be reconsidering or considering working in Palestine?
I would say your investment is essentially in the Palestinian people. And when you work in Palestine, you are expressing solidarity with them. And this is a young population that is incredibly hardworking, very passionate, and in spite of the difficulties, they have amongst the highest literacy rates in the world. They are highly educated, and they are extremely agile in the kind of work that they do. So I would say, if anything, double down on your investment in the Palestinian people. Having such hardworking people is what any investor would want.
Invaluable. Okay, Khaled al Sabawi, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for being with us on the Newsmakers, and thanks to our viewers for tuning in as well. We'll see you next time.